Hey friends, tonight we're stepping back into ancient Rome, somewhere most history books leave alone. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video, and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. There's something strangely calming about knowing others are listening to these same quiet stories at the same time, even from different places, in different nights of the world. So if you're still awake with me, you can simply settle in now. Let the lights soften a little, maybe let the room feel a bit heavier, a bit quieter. And let's ease into tonight's quiet hour together. Tonight you are not in your bedroom anymore. You are somewhere older. The stones are uneven beneath your feet. The air is warmer than it should be, and something is burning 3 streets over. Someone is already awake. Someone, in fact, has never gone to sleep. Welcome to Rome. Specifically, welcome to the street. Not the forum, not the baths, not the marble steps of the Capitoline Hill. The street, the actual road, the part no one writes home about, because if you survived it, you already knew what it was, and if you didn't survive it, you weren't writing anything. This is where the city lives, and it has opinions about you. You step outside just after dawn. The light is thin and pale. The street is already full. This is the Subura, the district tucked between the Esquiline and Viminal hills, not the elegant Rome of the history books, but the working Rome, the loud Rome, the Rome that smells of bread and urine and wet stone and something animal that you choose not to identify. It is a narrow street. Most Roman streets are narrow. The Insulae, the apartment blocks, rise 5, 6, sometimes 7 stories on either side, and the sky above you is a pale strip, barely wide enough to thread a cart through, which is precisely the problem, because carts cannot be here now, not yet, and the reason for that is stranger than you'd think. The street surface beneath you is paved in basalt, large, irregular volcanic stones fitted tightly together and slightly crowned in the center so that rain drains to the sides. You know where the sides are because of the smell. Everything flows to the sides. There are stepping stones, large raised blocks placed at intervals across the road at intersections, so that pedestrians can cross without walking through whatever has accumulated in the gutter. The stepping stones are spaced at cart wheel width, so that carts can pass between them without obstruction. You use the stepping stones. You step from one to the next. You keep your sandals dry, or at least drier. And here is the first thing to know about the Roman street. There is one type of Roman citizen who never uses the stepping stones. We will come back to that. For now, just notice. You are walking. Everyone around you is walking. The street is loud with feet and voices, and the creak of carrying poles, and the bark of a man selling hot chickpeas from a clay pot. But there are no carts, no wagons, no oxen, nothing wheeled. This is not an accident. But that wasn't the strangest part. The cart ban is older than the emperor's. Julius Caesar formalized it, but the bones of it come from the 12 tables, the earliest Roman law code, carved in bronze and mounted in the Forum sometime around 450 BC. The rule is simple. Wheeled vehicles are prohibited from the streets of Rome during daylight hours. Dawn to approximately the 10th hour, what we might call 4 in the afternoon. Carts, wagons, supply vehicles, construction haulers, all of them banned from the city during the day. There are exceptions. There are always exceptions in Roman law, because Romans understood that a law without exceptions is a law that creates problems, and Romans preferred to create problems on their own terms. Funeral carts are permitted. The dead do not wait for darkness. Construction vehicles working on public buildings approved by the Senate are permitted, because the Senate approved them, and the Senate's time is too valuable to reschedule. The Vestal Virgins travel by cart and are exempt from almost every traffic restriction ever written, because the Vestal Virgins are exempt from almost everything, and everyone in Rome has accepted this without significant complaint for 500 years. But for everyone else, every merchant, every supply chain, every farmer bringing grain from the countryside, the rule holds. You wait for dark. What this means in practice is that from roughly the 10th hour until dawn, the city of Rome transforms. The streets, quiet and pedestrian during the day, become a grinding, roaring river of cargo. Hundreds of carts, thousands of wheels on stone, the rimmed wheels of Roman cargo wagons on basalt, paving produce a sound that ancient writers compared, without apparent exaggeration, to a continuous earthquake. The satirist Juvenal, writing in the early 2nd century, complained that it was impossible to sleep in Rome because of the carts. He was not being precious. The noise was structural. It lasted all night, every night. Because everything the city needed, grain, timber, amphorae of wine and oil, bales of wool, live animals, worked metal, all of it arrived between dusk and dawn because it had to. You live on the 4th floor of an insula. You know this sound. You have learned, the way all Romans have learned, to sleep inside it rather than against it. A wry one-liner for modern ears. It was the white noise machine of the ancient world, and it was mandatory. And here is the part most historians quietly skip. The cart ban was not just about traffic management. It was about class, about who the street belonged to at what hour. And the answer, in Rome, is always the same answer. It belonged to whoever could afford to avoid it. By day, the street is a democracy of discomfort. Senator and freedman and slave all navigate the same narrow stones, the same overhanging balconies, the same risk of something falling from above, and things fell from above with regularity. Roman law acknowledged this. There are provisions in the legal texts for compensation when a pot or jar, thrown or dropped from a window, strikes a freeborn person. The law uses the word thrown quite deliberately. It was sometimes thrown. The upper floors of the insulae had no running water, no proper waste facilities, and a population of people who were tired and had made a calculation. This is where the stepping stones matter again. The stepping stones are for people who walk. And in Rome, the people who did not walk, the people who were carried, were the very wealthy, riding in litters borne by 4 to 8 slaves. The litter was essentially a box on poles. It moved at shoulder height. It cleared the stepping stones entirely. The man inside never touched the street. He saw it from above, through a curtain, if he looked at all. The filth, the noise, the negotiation of the stones, none of it reached him. His slaves, meanwhile, moved through it with bare feet, because slave footwear was not a universal provision, and the street was the street. Imagine explaining this to a modern person. You built an elaborate system of raised pedestrian crossings, the person asks. And they were used by everyone except the people rich enough to be carried. Yes, the system worked perfectly. It just worked for specific people. A grain merchant named, records suggest, something like Gaius, operating out of the Subura in the mid-1st century, would have known this walk. He moved between his warehouse near the Tiber and the buyers in the markets before the 3rd hour every morning, navigating the stepping stones, avoiding the overhang of a butcher's stall on corner, keeping to the shaded side in summer. He knew which streets were covered by awnings. The Valeria, stretched between buildings by shopkeepers who understood that a customer who was not squinting into the sun was a customer who might stop. He knew which corners flooded when it rained, which stepping stones were loose, which streets the vigiles. The Roman night watch had cleared for a funeral cart the previous evening, and not yet bothered to clean after. The street was not background. It was information. You read it the way you read a face. Inattention cost you time, sandals, or occasionally a broken collarbone. The street was not a place you passed through. It was a place you survived. That is not hyperbole. It is the Roman definition of a commute. So while the road told you exactly where to walk and who would not be walking beside you, the Romans had equally precise opinions about where to eat when you arrived at the other end. and who deserved a plate when they got there. The Thermopolium waited on the next corner. The clay pots were already warm. The queue was already forming, and the man at the back of it was already making a calculation about whether the food in the middle pot was worth the risk. It probably wasn't. He probably ate it anyway. That is a very Roman solution. Welcome to the corner of the Subura, somewhere near the 2nd hour of the morning. The Thermopolium is already open. It was open before you were awake, and it will be open after you go to sleep. And the man behind the counter has not visibly moved in either direction. He is there the way a wall is there. He is part of the fixture. The clay pots are warm. There is a queue. You join it. The counter is built from mortared stone, volcanic tufa, usually, or brick, and it runs along the front of a narrow shop, front that opens directly onto the street. There is no door, or rather the door is the entire front wall, folded back on wooden hinges before dawn. The counter itself is thick and solid, and sunk into its surface at regular intervals are the mouths of large ceramic vessels. The dolia, sealed vessels holding food that has been warm since. Before you can remember, the lids are wooden, the steam comes up around the edges. You are standing close enough to read the painted menu on the wall to the left of the counter. It is faded. Some of the letters have been repainted over earlier letters. The prices are in asses, small copper coins, and the figures are low enough that the man behind you in the queue, who is carrying a plasterer's bucket and has lime on his forearms up to the elbow, will be able to eat this morning. That is the point. That has always been the point. The smell is complex. Warm lentils, something fatty and roasted, wine that has been diluted with water until it is more water than wine. Bread from the bakery 3 doors down, arriving in a cloth, covered basket carried by a boy of perhaps 12, who sets it on the end of the counter and leaves without being acknowledged. Above all of this, something fermented and deeply saline that you cannot quite locate. It is in everything. You will come back to that. The counter is busy, not chaotic, busy in the way a place is busy when the same people come every morning and everyone knows the order of things. You do not sit. There is nowhere to sit. You stand at the counter, take your bowl when it is handed to you, eat with the spoon you have brought yourself or with the bread, return the bowl, and leave. If you are a person of some means, you may have sent a slave ahead to collect the food in a covered pot, which you will eat at home, or at least somewhere not here. But you are not, this morning, a person of some means. You are standing at the counter with lime dust blowing in from the street, and the food is warm, and that is enough. Something is slightly wrong about this place, and it takes a moment to understand what it is. There is no kitchen. There is no fire. The food arrived warm and will stay warm, but there is no cooking happening, just serving. Just the counter, the dolia, the man with the ladle. But that wasn't the strangest part. The reason the Thermopolium exists, the reason there are an estimated 250 of them in Pompeii alone, at the time of the eruption, not counting the ones that have not yet been excavated, is not convenience. It is architecture. Most Romans living in an insula had no kitchen, not a small kitchen. No kitchen. The insula, the Roman apartment block, was a wooden, framed multi-story structure packed with people, and open flames inside such a structure were a matter of civic policy rather than personal preference. Rome burned. Rome burned often. Rome burned so reliably that the Emperor Augustus eventually organized the vigiles specifically to address it. 7,000 men whose primary job was to catch fires before they consumed a district. The fires started somewhere. They started in kitchens. They started in rooms where people were trying to heat food over open braziers in wooden buildings 6 stories tall. The response to this problem was not, primarily, to build safer kitchens. The response was to move the cooking outside and sell it at a counter. One ingredient turns up in almost every Thermopolium record, and in the residue analysis of the actual dolia excavated from Pompeii and Herculaneum. It is not what you'd expect. We will come back to it. For now, the food. The dolia held thick stews, lentils cooked with herbs, spelt porridge, bean soups, cooked vegetables softened to the point of structural collapse. There were roasted pieces of meat of variable provenance. Duck was common, according to bone records from Pompeian refused deposits, along with pork and, less appetizingly, remnants consistent with dog, which is recorded in the sources without particular emphasis. There was bread. There was always bread. There was wine, sold already diluted, usually 1 part wine to 3 parts water, because undiluted wine at the 2nd hour of the morning was a statement most Romans chose not to make in public. The price for a standard meal, a bowl of stew, bread, a cup of pasca, ran to approximately 2 copper asses. 1 as would get you the bread, 3 would get you the meat. This was calibrated precisely to the daily wage of an unskilled laborer, which ran to approximately 8 to 12 asses per day. You could eat twice and still have money for something else. That was the calculation. It was performed every morning by several 100,000 people simultaneously. It was infrastructure. It just smelled like lunch. It wasn't the food that told you where you stood in Rome. It was something else entirely. Watch who eats where. The man with lime on his forearms eats standing at the counter, turned slightly toward the street because he is watching for someone or something. The woman 2 people down has a small child balanced on one hip and is eating with her free hand, efficiently, without looking at the bowl. Behind them, a man in a better tunic, not wealthy, but better, takes his food and carries it 3 steps away, turns his back to the counter, and eats facing the street, which is a subtle but real distinction. He is not quite eating at the Thermopolium. He has merely collected food in the vicinity of one. And somewhere further back in the city, in a private home with a proper kitchen and a cook who has been awake since before the Thermopolium opened, someone else is eating something prepared specifically for them, and it does not come from a sunken clay pot, and nobody is watching them eat it. The Thermopolium does not judge any of this. It is open, the pots are warm, that is all it offers, and it is enough. Residue analysis from the dolia of Pompeii, the actual chemical analysis of what was in those pots when Vesuvius closed the lid in 79 CE, found garum in nearly every vessel tested, not as a condiment placed beside the food, as a foundational ingredient, mixed in, cooked through, present in the stew, in the sauce, in the base of almost everything the Thermopolium served. Garum is fermented fish sauce. It is made by layering fish, whole small fish, or fish guts and offcuts, with salt in large clay amphorae, sealing them partially, and leaving them in the sun for several months while the contents liquefy. The liquid that drains from the bottom of this process is garum. It is intensely saline, deeply savory, brown, and possessed of a smell during production that Roman writers described in terms usually reserved for military catastrophe. The production of garum was legally required to happen outside city walls. Not suggested, required. The factories were in the suburbs, in the coastal towns, anywhere that was not somewhere people needed to breathe normally. The product itself, once processed and bottled, was in every kitchen in Rome that had a kitchen, and in every Thermopolium counter that did not. Romans used it the way a modern kitchen uses salt, and then continued. Garum went into stews, into sauces, into wine, into desserts made with honey. There is a Roman recipe for a sweet sauce involving garum, dried fruit, and reduced wine that was served over roasted meat. And the recipe notes, without irony, that it is excellent. Imagine explaining this to a modern person. You made a condiment, you say, out of month. Sold fermented fish. You put it in your desserts. Yes. And you were legally banned from making it near other people. Also yes. And yet, you ate it at every meal, without fail, for centuries. A tile, layer named, the records do not care about his name, eating at a Thermopolium near the Circus Maximus on an ordinary morning in the reign of Claudius, was eating garum. He did not think about this. He did not notice it. It was simply the flavor of food, the way food tasted, the baseline against which everything else was measured. The fish had been caught in the waters off Hispania 3 months ago. The process had taken all summer. The result was in his bowl. Food wasn't a choice, it was a system, and the system had a smell that followed you home. And if you survived breakfast, the next problem was your neighbor. Specifically, what your neighbor was doing to the wall between you. Or more precisely, what your neighbor was doing to the floor above you, and why the ceiling of your room had developed a new damp patch sometime in the 3rd hour of the night, and whether the patch was water or something worse, or something that defied the categories available to you in the early morning light. The Insula waited, 6 stories, 1 rope near the door, and on the upper floors a very specific calculation was being made about what the night had cost, and whether the morning would be better. It usually wasn't, but you climbed the stairs anyway. That is a very Roman solution. Welcome to the 4th floor. You know it is the 4th floor because your legs told you so on the way up. The staircase is narrow, single, file, unlit after the first landing, and built at an angle that suggests the architect was optimistic about human knee joints. The walls on either side are close enough to touch simultaneously. Most people do, on the way down in the dark, by accident. You are home. This is what home is. The Insula stretches above you and below you and on all sides, and it is full of people you will never formally meet, but whose lives you know in granular detail. You know when the woman on the 3rd floor argues with her husband, which is often, and you know when the couple on the 5th floor has guests, because the floor above you accepts sound the way a drum accepts a stick. You know the man directly across the internal courtyard by his cough, which begins at the 2nd hour and does not fully resolve until well past the 4th. You know the baby 2 doors down by the specific pitch of its distress, which you have learned to distinguish from the cat, which also lives on this floor and has opinions. The Insula itself is, from the outside, an impressive structure. 5 stories minimum in the cheaper districts, sometimes 7 or 8 in the areas near the Tiber, where land value pushed everything vertical. The ground floor is almost always commercial, the Thermopolium, the Fullonica, the cobbler, the lampoil cellar. And it is the best floor in the building because it is cool in summer, dry in winter, and close to the street. The rent for a ground, floor shop, or apartment is the highest in the building. Each floor you climb, the rent decreases. The top floor is the cheapest. The top floor is also the most dangerous. This is not a coincidence. You live on the 4th floor. You have made your calculation. The walls around you are brick, or they are supposed to be. In practice, the Insula is often a combination of fired brick, unfired mud brick, timber framing, and ambition. The upper floors, added by landlords who understood that vertical space was free money, are frequently lighter construction than the lower floors that were not designed to hold them. The whole structure settles continuously. The walls crack in predictable places, above the lintels, at the corners, in the spots where the timber framing has shifted a finger's width since last winter. There is one thing every resident on the upper floors keeps near the door. We will come back to that. For now, the room, your room, it is one room. It is approximately the size of a large cart. There is a window, a real window, with wooden shutters rather than glass, because glass in a window is a luxury that belongs to a different floor of a different building in a different part of city. When the shutters are open, you have light and air, and whatever the street sends up, which is noise and smell, and occasionally, in summer, a layer of fine grit from the traffic below. When the shutters are closed, You have darkness and stillness, and the sound of the building settling, which is its own kind of company. Something is wrong with the ceiling. There is a new crack in the plaster above the left corner that was not there last week. You have looked at it twice this morning already, but that wasn't the strangest part. The Insulae of Rome were, by any structural measurement, a catastrophe in ongoing negotiation with gravity. Roman law, under Augustus, set a height limit of 70 feet, roughly 6 stories, specifically because buildings were collapsing. Under Trajan, this was reduced further to 60 feet for the same reason. The limits were set not because anyone had run the engineering calculations and arrived at a safe number, but because buildings had already fallen, people had already died, and the rubble had already needed clearing. And the Senate had observed that this was happening with enough regularity to constitute a pattern. The collapse of an insula was not a rare event. It was a known risk, priced into the rent, factored into the daily calculus of Roman urban life, the way weather is factored into farming. Juvenal wrote about it directly. The man on the upper floors, he observed, is kept from sleep not only by the cart noise, but by the knowledge that the roof above him is held in place by a confidence he is not sure he shares. The landlord knew the building was compromised. This knowledge did not necessarily produce action. Roman tenancy law gave landlords obligations, but enforcement was irregular, and a landlord who owned 12 insulae in the Subura was managing a portfolio rather than a building. And distinction mattered. Repairs happened when the damage became visible to someone with authority. Until then, you patched. You watched the crack. You made the calculation about whether this winter would be the one. And you kept something near the door. 3 things had to be true for the upper floor insula to be survivable. The building had to be structurally adequate, which it often wasn't. The fire had to start on a floor below you, which gave you some warning. And you had to have already thought about how you were leaving, which most people had, because the alternative was not thinking about it. And that option had a very specific outcome. There were no fire escapes. There were no external ladders. There were the stairs, and there was the window, and the window was 4 stories above the street. A wry one-liner for anyone doing the mathematics. The street did not move, and here is the part most historians quietly skip. Fire in the insula was not an emergency. It was a scheduled event that had not yet occurred. The difference between the two was timing, not probability. The fire risk was so well understood in Rome that Augustus created the vigiles, the night watch, in part as a fire brigade. 7 cohorts of 1,000 men each, stationed in posts throughout the city, equipped with hand-pumped water engines, buckets, hooks for pulling burning timber clear of neighboring buildings, and blankets soaked in water or vinegar for smothering smaller flames. The vigiles patrolled at night, which was when the fires started, because night was when the cooking braziers were lit on the upper floors, the same floors where the Thermopolium's structural logic had exiled the cooking, and where people were now quietly, desperately trying to heat food and stay warm in rooms that had no fireplaces and no chimneys and no margin for error. The thing near the door was a rope, sometimes with a hook. A length of knotted rope, fixed to a beam near the window, long enough to reach the 3rd floor, or the 2nd, or at least far enough to make the remaining drop survivable rather than fatal. Some accounts suggest this was common enough in the upper insulae that landlords knew about it and said nothing, because an occupied building paid rent and the alternative was not worth conversation. You kept the rope near the door, not because you expected to need it, because in Rome preparation was not pessimism. It was literacy. You read the building the same way you read the street for information, for risk, for the location of the nearest exit. A woman named, no record preserves her name, only the account of her neighbor's account of the account, living on the 5th floor of an insula near the Circus Flaminius in the early 1st century, kept her rope coiled on a peg beside the door, next to her outdoor sandals, which she kept on the same peg because she had understood that the order in which you gathered things during a fire was decision best made before the fire, not during it. Her neighbor on the same floor had made no such preparation. Records suggest the neighbor was fine. The building did not fall that year. The rope was never used. She kept it anyway. Imagine explaining this to a modern person. You lived in an apartment, you say, that you kept an emergency evacuation rope for. Yes, and the landlord knew. Yes, and the city had a legal height limit, specifically because the buildings kept falling down. Also yes, and you renewed the lease without fail. Because the rent on the 4th floor was 3 asses a month less than the 3rd, and 3 asses a month, compounded over a year, was a coat for winter, and you had done the arithmetic, and the arithmetic was conclusive. Home wasn't comfort, it was a calculation, and the calculation almost always came out in favor of staying. So while the Insula held its crack and its rope and its ongoing structural optimism, the Romans had an equally systematic solution to the other problem the upper floors created. Not the fire, not the collapse, the other one. The problem that accumulated on every floor above the ground and had to go somewhere when the night was cold and the stairs were dark and the street was 4 stories down. The Fullers were already awake. The Pots were already in the street. And someone in the city had recently realized that this particular problem, properly collected and processed, was actually worth taxing. It was a career with a waiting list, and the emperor got his percentage. That is a very Roman solution. Welcome to the Cloaca Maxima. Not inside it, you do not want to be inside it, but near enough to understand what it is and what it is doing. It is doing quite a lot. It has been doing it for roughly 600 years by the time you are standing here in the reign of Vespasian on a street in the Campus Martius, watching a man with a clay pot make his morning collection. He is efficient. He has done this before. He will do it again tomorrow. He nods at you, which is more acknowledgement than most people receive at this hour, and moves on. This is waste management. This is how Rome survives. The Cloaca Maxima is the great drain of Rome. It was begun, according to the sources, under the King Tarquinius Superbus, sometime in the 6th century BCE, which would make it one of the oldest pieces of functional infrastructure still operating in the ancient world. It runs beneath the forum, beneath the valleys between the hills, channeling groundwater and runoff and the outflow of the public fountains and the larger latrines toward the Tiber, where it empties through an arched stone mouth large enough to sail a small boat through. Agrippa, the general who built the Pantheon's predecessor and oversaw much of Augustus's building program, reportedly inspected the Cloaca by boat. He found it sound. What the Cloaca Maxima did not do what it was never designed to do, and what it would take until the 19th century for any city to attempt systematically, was collect waste from private dwellings. It handled the public latrines. It handled the street drainage. It handled the baths. It handled the overflow from the aqueducts. It did not handle what happened inside the insulae on the upper floors at night, or what happened in the streets during the day, or what accumulated in the pots left at street corners by the fullers. For exactly that purpose, there is one detail about this system that the sanitation historians tend to gloss over. Someone was paid to collect it, specifically and in organized fashion, and it was a career with a waiting list. But that wasn't the strangest part. The Cloaca was a triumph of engineering. It drained the city. It prevented flooding. It carried away the output of hundreds of thousands of people living in proximity. What it did not prevent was the smell, which was structural, climatic, and total. The Roman street smelled the way the Roman street smelled, and the Cloaca was downstream of all of it. But that wasn't the strangest part. The public latrine, the Forica, was a Roman institution with its own social grammar. They were large rooms, sometimes freestanding buildings, sometimes attached to the baths. Along the interior walls ran continuous stone benches with keyhole-shaped openings at regular intervals, seats, side by side, without dividers, without privacy, without any architectural acknowledgement that what you were doing was a thing that people preferred to do alone. The seats were close. Your neighbor on the left and your neighbor on the right were close. There was, by the accounts of those who used them, conversation. Romans did not find this strange. The Fullonica was a social space, not primarily. Not in the way the bathhouse was primarily social, but incidentally, the way any place where the same people arrived at the same time every morning became social over time. There were regular users. There were preferred seats. There is a reference in the sources to a man who held his seat at the public latrine while a friend saved him a place in the queue at the Thermopolium around the corner, which suggests a level of coordinated mourning logistics that the sources do not comment on because it required no comment. Beneath the seats, a channel of running water carried waste away continuously, fed by aqueduct overflow or bath runoff. On the floor in front of the seats ran a shallow gutter of clean water. In this gutter sat the xylospongium, a sea sponge on a stick, shared among users, rinsed between uses in the gutter water. This was the toilet paper of the ancient world, shared on a stick, rinsed in a communal channel and replaced for the next user. 3 things had to be true for this to be acceptable. First, you had to have grown up with it, which Romans had. Second, the gutter water had to be running, which it usually was. Third, you had to be a Roman, for whom the Fullonica was infrastructure rather than intimacy. The third condition did all the work. There was also a fee to use the public latrine, a small one, fractions of an as, collected by an attendant at the entrance. This fee existed. The Emperor Vespasian collected it. He collected everything. It was sanitation. It just required a coin. And here is the part most historians quietly skip. The public latrines were the organized end of Roman waste management. The unorganized end was everything else, the street pots, the chamber pots emptied from windows, the piles in the alleys, the corners of the Insules, ground floors where the darkness was sufficient and the distance to the Fullonica was not. Roman law addressed this. Roman law addressed everything eventually. There were fines for throwing waste from windows, we have already covered the mule, and fines for depositing waste in prohibited locations, and fines for blocking the street drainage channels. The fines existed because the behavior requiring them also existed, continuously, everywhere, at all hours. Into this situation walked the fullers. The fullers were the Roman laundry industry. They cleaned wool cloth, newly produced fabric that came from the loom stiff with lanolin and debris, and used garments brought in by customers who needed them washed. The cleaning of wool required an agent that could break down grease and loosen fiber without damaging the textile. The Romans had found this agent. It was free, it was abundant. It was produced by every person in the city every day, and it required only collection and the willingness to stand in it for several hours. The career with the waiting list was that of the urine collector. The Fullones placed large clay pots at regular intervals along the streets of Rome, near the Insulae, near the Thermopolia, near anywhere that foot traffic was heavy and privacy was relative. People used them, the fullers collected them. The urine was transferred to large vats at the Fullonica, where workers, the treaders, stood knee deep and stomped the cloth against the vat walls and floor, using the ammonia content of the aged urine to break down the grease in the wool. This worked. It worked well enough that the Fullonica was a thriving industry in every Roman city of any size. It worked well enough that the Emperor Vespasian, surveying the Roman economy for revenue streams in the early 70s CE, looked at the Fullonica and decided that the urine itself, the raw material, the thing being collected from the street pots, should be taxed. His son Titus objected to this. The tax, Titus felt, was beneath the dignity of the imperial office. Vespasian's response has been preserved by the historian Suetonius. He held a coin up to Titus's face and asked whether it smelled. Titus said it did not. Vespasian said, and yet it comes from urine. The phrase *pecunia non olet*, money does not smell, became one of the most quoted lines in Roman history. It is now used in business schools. The treaders earned a wage. The collectors earned a wage. The tax on the urine went to the imperial treasury. The finished cloth went to the customer, clean and pressed, and the customer wore it to the forum and the baths and the dinner party without thinking about what had cleaned it. Because this was Rome, and Rome had agreed collectively not to think about it, and the agreement held for several centuries. Imagine explaining this to a modern person. You taxed urine, you say, collected from the street, used to wash clothes. And the emperor's defense of the tax is still quoted in business schools. Yes, that is correct, all of it. A fuller named, the Pompeian evidence preserves the names of several Fullonica owners, though not the treaders, operated a Fullonica near the Via dell'Abbondanza in Pompeii, employing a staff of at least 6 people based on the size of the vats. He paid his urine tax quarterly. He posted his prices on the wall outside. He accepted drop-off garments from customers who returned 3 days later to collect them, clean and folded, smelling of nothing in particular, which was the point, and which cost 2 asses for standard tunic and 4 for a toga, which was a significant garment requiring significant effort and a proportionally larger vat. The toga, cleaned and whitened with fuller's earth, a fine clay powder applied after the urine process, and before the pressing, was then draped around the customer and worn to Senate meetings and law courts and public ceremonies as a symbol of Roman citizenship, of gravitas, of the dignity of the free, born Roman male. It had spent 3 days in fermented urine. Nobody mentioned this. It was not a secret. It simply was not the part of the process that required discussion. Cleanliness wasn't purity. It was chemistry, and the chemistry had a very specific origin, and the origin had been taxed, and the tax was constitutional, and the toga was white. And while the fullers handled the laundry, the Romans had an equally systematic answer for the other problem. What to do when someone died on the street, which happened more than you'd think, and more publicly than you'd prefer. The Libitina were already awake. They worked near the grove of Libitina, outside the city, in a building that served simultaneously as registration office, equipment depot, and something that does not have a clean modern equivalent. They kept records, they had rates, they had a waiting list of a different kind, and it was longer than the fullers. Death wasn't chaotic in Rome. It was administered, and the administration had a fee schedule. That is a very Roman solution. Welcome to the Grove of Libitina. It is on the Esquiline Hill, just outside the dense press of the city proper, and it is quieter here than you expect. There are trees. There is a small temple, or what functions as a temple, a building of moderate size with a permanent staff and a great deal of administrative paperwork. Near the entrance, a large ledger is updated daily. Every death in Rome is recorded in it. The name, the district, the cause where known, the fee paid. The fee is always paid. That is what the grove is for. You arrive at a moment between things. The morning's first body has already been collected from the Subura, a freedman, the record will note, of indeterminate age, found near the base of an Insula staircase in circumstances, the vigiles, classified as unremarkable. The second collection is being organized. 2 men with a litter, a flat wooden frame with carrying handles. Not the cushioned kind, are consulting briefly with the man who keeps the ledger. The consultation is quick. There is a rate for this. There is a rate for everything. The Libetiner, the undertakers of Rome, operated from this grove and its associated buildings, and they were a guild in the formal Roman sense, organized, licensed, fee-regulated, with specific legal authority to handle the dead that ordinary citizens did not possess. They were also, depending on your social position and your family's resources, the people who would determine how you left this world. Not who you were in it, just the logistics of your departure, which Rome had decided was a professional matter. The smell here is not what you might expect. The grove itself smells of earth and old wood. The administrative building smells of ink and lamp oil. The smell you are thinking of is further back, past the door that is kept closed. There is one record of a woman who attended more than 300 funerals over the course of her career in Rome. She was not related to a single one of the dead. We will come back to her. The records are specific about what she was paid, and the specificity is instructive. For now, the system. How death worked in Rome when it worked well, which was when the family had money, and how it worked when it didn't, which was the more common situation, and the one the libertinari I managed with the same flat efficiency they brought to everything else. But that wasn't the strangest part. A Roman of means died at home. This was the preferred arrangement not because the home was more comfortable for the dying, though it may have been, but because the home was the correct stage for the first act of Roman death. The body was washed by the family, anointed with oils, dressed in the best clothing the household possessed. If the deceased had held public office, had been a magistrate, a senator, a military commander of sufficient rank, a wax death mask was made. This was not metaphorical. A craftsman arrived within hours of the death and pressed wax against the face of the corpse to take an impression, from which a mask was cast. The masks were kept in the family's atrium in small wooden shrines. When a family member of subsequent generations died, all the ancestral masks were brought out, dressed in the toga of the office held, and carried in the funeral procession by actors hired for purpose. This meant that at a sufficiently old and distinguished Roman family's funeral, the procession included living representations of the dead, stretching back generations, all dressed in period-appropriate office, where, walking through the streets of Rome in a column of theatrical ancestors. The effect on bystanders was described by the Greek historian Polybius, who witnessed such a procession in the 2nd century BC, as overwhelming. He meant it as a compliment. The procession itself was a public event, deliberately staged for maximum visibility. The body was carried on a bier, a flat wooden frame held at shoulder height, preceded by musicians, horn players, flutists, and the professional mourners. Behind the bier came the family, then freed slaves of the household, then clients and associates. The route passed through the forum, where, for men of sufficient status, the funeral oration was delivered from the rostra, the speaker's platform. The oration was a public speech about a private life, delivered to whoever was in the forum that morning, which was everyone, because Rome understood that a good funeral oration was worth stopping for. 3 things had to be true for this procession to function. The family had to have the resources to hire it, the libertinar, I had to organize it, and the weather had to cooperate, because Rome had no mechanism for postponing a public funeral, and the body had limited patience. It was theater. It was also grief. The two were not in conflict. Romans understood that grief required an audience, and the audience was the city. And here is the part most historians quietly skip. The music at a Roman funeral was not incidental. It was contractual. The musicians were hired at a specific rate, for a specific duration, playing specific pieces. The mourning was also contractual, and the woman who attended 300 funerals was the reason why. The Refectory were professional mourners. Women, always women in Roman practice, hired to walk in the funeral procession, to wail, to beat their breasts, to tear at their hair, to produce the visible, audible, public manifestation of grief that Roman funerary tradition required, and that the actual family, stunned and exhausted, could not always generate at the necessary volume. The woman in the records attended more than 300 funerals over a career of perhaps 20 years. She was paid by the quality and quantity of her mourning, not a flat fee. but a rate calibrated to the volume of grief produced, the duration of the procession, and the social status of deceased. A senator's funeral paid more than a merchant's. A merchant's paid more than a freedman's. The grief was scaled accordingly. This was not considered fraudulent or disrespectful. It was considered professional. The Prefecti were mourning on behalf of the community, giving the dead the send-off that Roman tradition required regardless of whether the surviving family could produce it. They were filling a function. They were skilled at it. The best of them were known by name. Some had regular clients, families who had used them before and requested them specifically when the next death arrived, which in a Roman family of any size was not an infrequent occurrence. One source describes a Prefecti of particular reputation who could begin weeping at a signal so precise and so convincing that the actual family members would begin weeping in response, which was the desired effect. She charged accordingly. A soldier of the Praetorian Guard, stationed in Rome during the reign of Claudius, attended his commanding officer's funeral as part of the honor guard, and noted in a letter, preserved fragmentarily, that the woman at the front of the procession cried more convincingly than anyone he had seen in battle, and that he found this unsettling in a way he did not have words for. He did not mean it as criticism. He was not sure what he meant it as. Imagine explaining this to a modern person. You hired someone to cry at the funeral, you say. Yes, at professional rates, calibrated to the deceased status. Yes, and the most skilled ones were famous for it. Also yes, and the family wept more because the professional was weeping. That was the mechanism. It worked every time. Below the Prefecti, below the organized processions and the ancestral masks and the forum orations, was the other end of Roman death. The puticuli. The puticuli were pits. Large communal pits outside the city walls on the Esquiline Hill, not far from the grove of Libitina, close enough that the administrative distance between them was shorter than you would prefer it to be. Into the puticuli went the bodies of those who could not afford the libitinarii, or who died without family, or who were slaves with owners who declined to pay for burial, or who were simply found in the street and collected by the vigiles and carried to the edge of the city and deposited. The pits were large. They were used continuously. They were covered over periodically, and new ones dug. Augustus eventually commissioned a large burial ground, the Horti Misenotes, on the Esquiline, partly to address the puticuli, partly because the smell had become a diplomatic problem when foreign visitors arrived in Rome and were given tours of the hill. The pits were covered. New construction happened above them. The Esquiline became, over the following century, one of the more pleasant residential districts in the city. Death wasn't dramatic. It was practical. And the practical had a rate card, and the rate card had a bottom, and the bottom was a pit, and the pit was on a hill, and the hill was later covered with gardens. And honestly, by the 2nd century, the gardens were quite nice. Death was a profession. So was law. And in Rome, justice was not something that happened indoors. It happened on the street, in public, loudly, and sometimes without warning. The aediles office was already open. The complaint ledger was already open. Somewhere in the Subura, a pot had fallen from a window and struck something. The records would specify the something before noon, and the calculation of damages had already begun. The street had rules for the living and rules for the dead, and the rules for the living were, on balance, the more complicated set. That is a very Roman solution. Welcome to the street corner where the law lives. It does not live in a building. There is no courthouse on this block, no chamber with benches and a raised platform and a man in formal dress behind a table. The law lives here, in the street, in the person of a man whose name is painted on a white board near the entrance to the forum, and who is currently walking toward you through the morning crowd with 2 assistants and the expression of someone who has already dealt with 3 complaints this morning and has opinions about all of them. This is the aedile. He has jurisdiction over your street, your market, your neighbor's window, and the weight of the bread you bought 20 minutes ago. He may have thoughts about the bread. The aediles were magistrates of the middle rank, elected annually. 2 pairs of them for the city of Rome, the curule aediles and the plebeian aediles, each pair responsible for a set of overlapping functions that a modern city would distribute among a zoning board, a health department, a weights and measures office, a building inspection service, and a parks department. The aedile oversaw all of this simultaneously, in person, on foot, in the street, because the street was where all of it happened. His responsibilities, in the order that the sources tend to list them: maintenance of public buildings and temples, oversight of public games and festivals, supervision of markets, enforcement of weights and measures, regulation of street traffic and public space, management of the water supply, and policing of public morality as it expressed itself in the street. This last category was the one with the most interpretive flexibility, which made it the most interesting, and the one from which the most stories have survived. The aedile walked his district. This was not a metaphor or a ceremony. It was the mechanism of his office. He had no permanent staff beyond his assistants, the apparitors, and the physical presence of his inspection. A market stall with a thumb on the scale was discovered by walking past it and checking. An illegal structure built into the street was identified by walking into it. A street that had been narrowed by a shopkeeper who had extended his counter 18 inches into the public right-of-way. A common practice, addressed in the sources with the weariness of phenomenon nobody expected to stop, was measured with a rod carried by the assistant on the left. There is a law preserved in the Digest, the great compilation of Roman legal opinion, assembled under Justinian in the 6th century, that specifies, in careful language, exactly how much compensation is owed when a pot or jar thrown or dropped from a window strikes a freeborn person. The figure is double the damages caused. If the person is killed, the statute sets a flat sum rather than a damages calculation, because a killed person cannot report their damages, and the law found this gap untidy. But there is a second law, adjacent to this one in the same section of the Digest, that addresses a more specific situation. The specificity is the interesting part. The street was, in Roman legal thinking, a public trust. It belonged to no one specifically, which meant it was administered by everyone collectively, which meant in practice it was administered by the aedile, and disputes about it were settled in open in front of whoever was present, because Roman justice operated on the assumption that public accountability was itself a form of enforcement. But that wasn't the strangest part. The 12 Tables, Rome's foundational law code, had opinions about noise, specifically about the noise made at funerals, which were required to be modest in proportion to the estate of the deceased, not because Rome was indifferent to grief, but because competitive funeral display among aristocratic families had become a form of political theater that the early republic found destabilizing. The law capped the number of musicians. It capped the number of mourners. It specified the permissible fabrics for burial garments. It attempted, in other words, to regulate sorrow by statute, which is the kind of move that only a legal culture of genuine ambition would attempt. The aedile was also responsible, in some periods and some cities, for enforcing the noise ordinances on the living. The cart ban was his to enforce at the edges, specifically the hours at which carts were permitted to enter and leave the city. A cart operator moving through the streets before the permitted hour, or lingering after sunrise when the ban resumed, was subject to the aedile's attention. The fine was not enormous. The disruption of being stopped and inspected and fined by a magistrate and his assistants in the middle of the street, while your cargo sat on the cart and your ox grew impatient, was its own Additional cost, which the law understood, and the aedile understood, and the carter understood, and all three parties accepted as the terms of doing business. Three things made the aedile's position both powerful and precarious. First, his authority was real but bounded. He could fine, confiscate, and order removal, but he could not imprison, and the most serious offenses went to higher magistrates, and eventually the praetor. Second, his term lasted 1 year, after which he was a private citizen again, which meant that every fine he levied and every merchant he antagonized was a potential future enemy. Third, he paid for the public games his office required him to produce from his own funds, as a form of compulsory public generosity. And the expectation of these games meant that every aedile entered office with a budget calculation that had nothing to do with his official salary and everything to do with how much he could afford to spend to maintain his political viability. The aedileship was often the entry point to higher office. It was also, for those who misjudged the finances, an expensive detour. It was governance. It just required personal investment at a rate that the law did not specify, and everyone understood. And here is the part most historians quietly skip. The aedile handled the days. The night was a different jurisdiction, with different rules, and different men, and a considerably more ambiguous relationship to the law they were nominally enforcing. The vigiles, the night watch, were established by Augustus as a paramilitary force of freed slaves, 7 cohorts of 1,000 men each, divided across the 14 regions of the city. Their primary function was fire prevention and fire response. Their secondary function was the policing of the nighttime streets, which in a city of perhaps 1 million people, without artificial lighting beyond private lamps and public torch stands, and with the cart traffic running continuously from dusk to dawn, was a significant undertaking. The vigiles carried water equipment, hand pumps, buckets, hooks for pulling burning material away from structures, vinegar, soaked blankets. They also carried clubs. The clubs were for the other part of the job. The second law in the digest, the one adjacent to the pot from window statute, addresses the vigiles specifically. It specifies that a vigile who detains a person found on the street at night without a lamp or a stated purpose is acting within his authority. The lamp is the key. A person with a lamp has a destination. A person without one is, in the legal language of the digest, a vagus, a wanderer, and the vagus had no legal protection from the vigile's attention. The lamp was a legal document. It said, "I am going somewhere. I have a reason. I will be there shortly." A freedman named. The sources give us the type rather than the name, but the type is precise, working as a delivery runner in the Transtiberum district in the early 2nd century, moving between a warehouse near the river and a private home on the edge of the Aventine, carried his lamp not because the route required light, but because the vigiles required the lamp. This was understood. The lamp cost a fraction of an as to fill with oil. The alternative was a conversation with the vigiles that would at minimum delay the delivery and at maximum result in a fine, a beating, or a night in the lockup adjacent to the vigile post, which was described by one source as a room that discouraged extended stays. The vigiles were also the mechanism of informal street justice at the lower end of the social scale. A man who could not access the aedile's complaint process because he was a slave, because he was a foreigner, because the offense was too small for the magistrate's attention, could sometimes achieve a result through the vigiles, provided the vigiles agreed with his assessment of the situation, which they sometimes did and sometimes did not, and the difference between those two outcomes was not always legible in advance. Imagine explaining this to a modern person. You had a police force, you say, that was also a fire brigade. Yes, staffed entirely by freed slaves. Yes, who operated only at night. Also yes, and the test for whether you were doing something wrong was whether you were carrying a lamp. That was the mechanism. It worked well enough. the city did not burn down all at once. And honestly, for a city of that size, in that era, with those materials and that density, the fact that it did not burn down all at once is the more remarkable administrative achievement. Below the vigiles, below the aedile, below the organized legal structure of Roman street governance, was the mob. The Roman crowd was a political force that the sources treat with a combination of respect and discomfort. It could be organized by a senator or a demagogue or nobody in particular, because sometimes a crowd simply decides that something is wrong and acts on that decision without waiting for official authorization. The street absorbed this. The street had always absorbed this. The stepping stones were still there in the morning. The pots were still at the corners. The aedile's white board was still near the forum entrance. The street was not lawless. It was governed by a layered system of formal authority, informal authority, and the constant negotiation between them that is the actual texture of life in a dense urban space. The law wasn't abstract. It was the man walking toward you with two assistants and an expression, and he had thoughts about your bread. But while Rome was building its street laws and its latrine systems and its layered apparatus of aediles and vigiles and professional mourners and urine taxes, something very different was already taking shape in the mountains of Italy, something quieter, more enclosed, and in its own way, just as strange. Long before the great cathedrals rose above the skyline, there were smaller structures in the hills. Low, roofed stone, walled, surrounded by gardens no one outside could enter. And inside, a community of men who had handed over everything, their names, their possessions, their schedule, their sleep to a document 12 chapters long that told them exactly how to live. From the moment they opened their eyes until the moment they closed them, the rule was already written. The bell was already rung. And somewhere in a dormitory on a hillside in 6th century Italy, a man was already awake who had agreed in writing never to be anything other than exactly this. Welcome to the monastery. The lights are low. They are always low. Long before the great cathedrals were built, there were smaller, stranger structures in the hills of Italy. Not palaces, not fortresses, not temples in the Roman sense, open, public, ceremonial. These were enclosed spaces. Low stone walls surrounding a church, a dormitory, a garden, a well. The gate faced the road, and the gate was usually closed, and the person inside who heard you knock was not required to open it immediately. He was required to wait, to listen, to knock again if you knocked again. The rule specified the number of times. This is the Benedictine monastery, circa the 6th century CE. This is what comes after Rome. Benedict of Nursia wrote his rule sometime around 530 CE at a community on Monte Cassino in central Italy, and what he produced was not, primarily, a spiritual document. It was an operating manual. It covered, in 73 short chapters, every significant aspect of daily life for a community of men who had chosen to live together in an enclosed space under the authority of a single elected leader, the abbot, for the remainder of their natural lives. The rule specified when to wake, when to pray, when to eat, when to work, when to speak. It specified in considerable detail when not to speak, which was most of the time. It specified what to wear. The habit, the monk's garment, was wool, because wool was available and durable and modest, and the rule was indifferent to comfort in a structural rather than a cruel way. Comfort was simply not. Among the variables it was optimizing for the cowl, the tunic, the scapular, a long strip of cloth worn over the tunic front and back, originally a work apron, retained as a garment because the rule had incorporated it, and the rule did not revise casually. The sandals, except in winter, when the rule permitted additional foot coverings, because the rule was written by a man who had stood on stone floors in the Italian winter and understood that suffering had its uses and frost bite did not. the rule also specified what a monk was permitted to own. The answer was almost nothing: a stylus, a writing tablet, the needle and thread required to mend his own habit. Beyond these, personal possessions were not permitted, because personal possessions implied personal will, and personal will was precisely what the monk had agreed at the moment of his profession to surrender. There is one thing, however, that a monk was permitted to keep always permanently, something that no regulation could confiscate and no abbot could redistribute. It is the only truly private property in the monastery, and it explains something important about how the system actually functioned beneath the rule's surface of total institutional control. The monastery was a total institution. This is the sociological term, and the medieval monks would not have recognized it, but they would have recognized the description: a place where every aspect of life, waking, eating, working, sleeping, speaking, not speaking, is organized by a single authority and conducted within a single enclosed space, in the company of the same small group of people, indefinitely. The monastery was this. It was also, and simultaneously, the most sophisticated administrative structure in post-Roman Europe, the primary repository of literacy and manuscript production, the most reliable source of medical care in most regions, the largest institutional landowner in many territories, and the only place in the early medieval world where you were reasonably likely to find a man who could read Latin, keep accurate accounts, brew consistent ale, and treat a fever with something other than prayer alone. But that wasn't the strangest part. The entry process was not immediate. The rule specified a deliberate, extended period of testing before a candidate was accepted into the community. A man who arrived at the monastery gate and asked to enter, the postulant, was first made to wait. The rules specified 4 or 5 days of continued knocking, of being ignored or turned away, not out of cruelty, but out of deliberate friction. The monastery was a permanent commitment. The rule wanted the candidate to understand this before he was inside it. If he persisted, he was admitted as a guest. He observed the community's life from the margins for a period, eating with the monks, attending the offices, watching without participating. He was then given the rule to read, the entire rule. He was told explicitly what it would cost him. He was given time to reconsider. If he still wished to proceed, he entered the novitiate, a year of probationary membership, during which the novice master observed him continuously, and the community assessed whether his character was compatible with the life. At 3 months, he was read the rule again. At 6 months, again. At 10 months, again. The repetition was not pedagogical. He had heard it, he could read it, he knew it. The repetition was psychological. The rule wanted the novice to understand at each reading that he was choosing this with full information, and that the information had not changed, and that the choice remained his. If he completed the year and still wished to proceed, he made his profession. He stood before the community in the church and made 3 vows. Stability: he would remain in this monastery for the rest of his life, not wander between communities. Conversion of life: he would continuously work to improve his character according to the rule. And obedience: he would do what the abbot told him, without argument, without delay, without the internal reservation that constituted, in the rule's language, a kind of disobedience even if the action was performed. He then wrote these vows on a document in his own hand and placed the document on the altar. He prostrated himself before the community. The community received him. From this moment he was a monk, and the monastery was his world, and the world outside the gate was, in a formal and practical sense, no longer his concern. 3 things then happened simultaneously. His previous social identity was legally suspended. He could not own property, enter contracts, or appear in court as an independent agent. His new identity was assumed. He might receive a new name, though this was not universal in early Benedictine practice. And his schedule began, the schedule he would keep, with minor seasonal variations, for the rest of his life. It was conversion, it just had a paper trail, and here is the part most historians quietly skip: the oblation of children. Benedict's rule permitted, expected, in practice, that parents could offer their sons to a monastery in childhood. Sometimes in infancy, the child was placed on the altar, wrapped in the altar cloth, and offered to God by his parents, who then, in most cases, went home. The child stayed. He grew up in the monastery. He learned to read in the monastery. He took his vows in the monastery, typically in his early teens, on behalf of a commitment made for him before he could form words. This was not considered a cruelty. It was considered a gift to the child, who would receive education and stability and spiritual formation. To the family, who would receive the intercession of a monk praying permanently on their behalf. To the monastery, which received labor and talent and the legitimacy of family connection. The child who grew up in the monastery often knew no other world. He sometimes became the most capable man in the community, the one who understood the rule most completely, who had internalized its rhythms without the friction of adult conversion. He was, in a real sense, made by the institution. The institution was made partly by him. He kept one thing that was always his memory. The vast internal library of scripture, psalm, liturgical text, and chant that a monk memorized over years of repetition. The entire psalter of 150 psalms, committed to memory over the course of the novitiate, the prayers of the 8 daily offices, the readings of the church year, the rule itself, in its entirety, this was his. It lived in him, no fire destroyed it, no abbot redistributed it, no rule could revoke it. In a world where books were rare and expensive, and a single manuscript could represent years of labor, the man who carried the text in his head was himself a library. The memory was property. It was the only property the rule could not touch, and the most valuable thing in the building. Imagine explaining this to a modern person. You memorize the entire book of Psalms, you say, 150 poems. In Latin, yes, before you were allowed to do anything else. Also yes. And this was considered the beginning of your education, not the end of it. That is correct. And you did it in a building you would not leave for the rest of your life, without complaint, as a gift, more or less, yes. And honestly, once the Psalter was inside you, once it had taken up residence in the part of the mind where things are kept without effort, the way a street learned in childhood never quite leave you. It was apparently not as burdensome as it sounds. The monks who wrote about it did not describe the memorization as oppressive. They described it as filling. The text occupied the silence. The silence was very long. The text was, in that context, company. The rule told the monk when to sleep. It was equally specific about what to eat, and the silence required during meals had a loophole that took 3 centuries to close, and that the monks, in the meantime, had developed into a minor art form entirely their own. The refectory was already set. The reader was already at the pulpit. And somewhere at the far end of the table, a monk was making a gesture with his left hand that meant something specific, something that had a name, a history, and a place in a written lexicon that still survives. The gesture meant cheese, or possibly something else. The scholars are still arguing about it. That is a very Benedictine solution. Welcome to the refectory. It is a long, stone-floored room, and it is almost entirely quiet. The monks file in from the church in an order that has not changed since the community was founded, senior to junior, with the abbot at the head of the table and the newest novice at the far end, which is also the coldest end, because the room's single source of warmth is the body heat of the men inside it. And warmth, like everything else in the monastery, distributes according to rank. The benches scrape The bowls are already placed. Everyone sits. The abbot nods. Everyone sits. Before the food arrives, a monk climbs to the pulpit. The pulpit is a raised wooden platform near one wall, accessible by a short flight of stone steps, and the monk who climbs it carries a book. He opens it. He begins to read aloud. He will not stop reading until the meal ends. He will read through the serving of the food, through the eating, through the clearing of the bowls, through the silent rising of the community, and the return procession to the church. He will read several thousand words. He will not eat during this time. This is the rule's solution to the problem of communal eating, which the rule identified as a potential site of disorder, specifically of conversation, of gossip, of the small social negotiations that accumulate in a community of men who spend all their time together and have, in the absence of silence, a great deal to say to one another. The reading solved this. It replaced conversation with Scripture, with the lives of the saints, with selected passages from approved theological texts. It was edifying. It was also, for the reader, a form of additional labor, which is why the reading was rotated. A different monk each week, selected in advance, given the text to prepare, expected to read clearly, and at a volume that reached the far end of the long room where the novices sat in the cold. The monks ate in silence. The rule was specific about this. They did not speak. They did not make noise with their bowls or their spoons in a way that drew attention. They did not gesture to one another in a way that constituted communication, except that they did gesture. They had to, because silence did not mean immobility, and a meal required a minimum number of transactions, more bread, more wine, less of this. None of that could not be performed without some form of communication between the monk at the bowl and the monk doing the serving. And so the monasteries developed a sign language. The monks developed at least 40 distinct hand signs for food alone. One of them is still debated by scholars. We will come back to it. The sign language is older than the debate, and the debate is older than most universities. The food itself was, by any measure, simple. The rule specified 2 cooked dishes at the main meal, the prandium, taken around midday or the 6th hour, so that a monk who could not eat one for reasons of health or digestion had an alternative. These dishes were legumes, primarily lentils, dried peas, beans, cooked with whatever flavoring was available, which in a well-provisioned monastery might include oil, herbs from the garden, salt. There was bread. There was always bread, and the rules specified the daily allowance. 1 pound of bread per monk, to be divided between the meals of the day. There was a cooked vegetable when the garden produced one. There was, on ordinary days, no meat. But that wasn't the strangest part. The rule's prohibition on meat was specific and structural. Quadrupeds, 4-legged animals, were not to be eaten by the monks, except in cases of serious illness, when the infirmarian might prescribe meat as a restorative. This was not squeamishness. It was a theological position. Meat was associated with vigor, with the body's animal appetites, with the kind of physical energy that the monastic life was designed to redirect. A monk on a legume diet was a monk whose body was making fewer demands. That was the theory. The practice was more nuanced because the rule did not prohibit fowl. Birds were not quadrupeds, and so chicken and duck and goose appeared on the monastic table at feast days, and the distinction between a feast day and an ordinary day was in a sufficiently creative reading of the liturgical calendar, available more often than a strict accounting would suggest. The wine was not prohibited. The rule acknowledged this directly with a trace of what reads as resignation. Benedict wrote that while monks should drink sparingly, since wine is no drink for monks, he was unwilling to impose complete abstinence on a community in an era and region where water was unreliable, and wine was both nutrition and medicine. The daily allowance was 1 hemina, approximately a quarter of a modern liter of wine, mixed with water, served at both meals. On feast days, the allowance increased. On fast days, it decreased or disappeared. The abbot controlled the wine. The abbot controlled everything, which meant the abbot controlled the feast day calendar, which meant a popular abbot with a well-managed cellar could make the community's experience of the rule considerably more pleasant than a strict reading would imply. Best case scenario: a feast day falls on a day when the kitchen has produced something good. The wine allowance is doubled. The reader at the pulpit has a clear voice and a short text, and the abbot catches the eye of the senior monk at the far end of the table, and gives a small nod that means the second course will be served before the reading ends. Worst case scenario: it is an ordinary Wednesday in February. The lentils have been cooking since before matins. The reader has chosen a passage from the longer letters of Garum, and the wine has been diluted to the point where it contributes flavor without any of its other properties. The monks ate both meals. They recorded neither complaint, and here is the part most historians quietly skip. The silence was not total. It was technical, and the sign language the monks developed to navigate its technicalities was elaborate enough that several monasteries wrote it down, producing what amount to illustrated dictionaries of monastic hand communication. The customaries and these documents survive. The Cluniac Customary, produced at the great Burgundian monastery of Cluny in the 11th century, records a lexicon of over 300 signs. The signs for food occupy the largest section. The food signs were organized by category. Bread had a sign, the index finger and thumb of one hand forming a circle, pressed against the palm of the other. Fish had a sign, the hand moved laterally in a sinuous motion, suggesting the movement of a tail through water. Eggs had a sign, oil had a sign. Salt had a sign, a rubbing gesture between the thumb and first two fingers, which is nearly universal across documented monastic sign lexicons, suggesting it was intuitive enough to have been invented independently in multiple communities. The sign for cheese is the problem. The Cluniac Customary records a sign for cheese involving a specific compression of the fingers and a rotation of the wrist that is described precisely enough to be followed, but ambiguously enough that scholars attempting to reconstruct it have produced at least 3 distinct gestures, each defensible from the text, each looking entirely unlike the others. A second customary, from Canterbury, records a different sign for cheese entirely. A third, from a German house in the Herse, our Reformed tradition, records a third sign with a notation suggesting that this sign was different from the one used before the Reform, implying that someone had revised the cheese sign at some point in the monastery's history, for reasons the notation does not explain. The monks knew they had multiple signs in circulation. Records from the 11th and 12th centuries suggest that monks from different houses sometimes had to negotiate their sign vocabularies when they visited one another's communities. A guest monk making a sign for cheese that his hosts recognized as the sign for salt, or vice versa, with the resulting confusion playing out in silence, because both parties were still in the refectory, and the rule did not suspend itself for disambiguation. A monk at Cluny in the early 12th century, a man perhaps 30 years into his monastic life, who had not spoken at a meal since his novitiate, ate with the efficiency of long practice. He ate precisely what was served, signaled for the bread twice, signaled for the wine once, and at some point during the second reading signaled for cheese, using the sign his house had used since before he arrived. Whether the serving monk recognized it as cheese or as something else is not recorded. The bowl either did or did not arrive. He ate what was in it. Imagine explaining this to a modern person. You developed an entire sign language, you say, specifically so you could ask for food without technically breaking the silence rule. Yes, and there were multiple competing versions of the cheese sign. Also yes, and monks from different monasteries sometimes miscommunicated in silence about cheese. That is what the records suggest, and nobody spoke to resolve it because the rule said not to speak. Also correct, And honestly, the cheese sign debate has been running for 1,000 years longer than the cheese. The cheese is gone. The debate remains. That is the monastic tradition's most reliable product. Documentation that outlasts its subject. Food wasn't fuel, it was theology, and the theology had a sign for everything except agreement. By now, you understand what the monk ate. What he did with his hands during the other 22 hours is where it gets stranger, specifically in a cold room on the north side of the cloister, where the light came through a single small window and was never quite sufficient, and where a man might spend 8 hours producing 4 pages of text in a hand so careful and so controlled that it looked, to a modern eye, like a font rather than a person. The Scriptorium was already occupied. The vellum was already prepared, and somewhere in the margin of a manuscript that would survive for 1,200 years, a monk had already written something that had nothing to do with the text he was copying. We will come to what he wrote. It is still quoted. It is not about God. Welcome to the coldest room in the monastery. It is on the north side of the cloister, which was deliberate. North light is consistent. It does not shift across the page the way southern or western light shifts, does not create moving shadows that interfere with the precise work being done at the desks. The Scriptorium was positioned for the light, the way a surgeon positions a lamp, not for comfort, but for accuracy. Comfort was not among the variables. The room has no fireplace. Fire and vellum and ink in proximity was a risk the monastery had calculated and declined. You sit at a slanted desk. Your breath fogs slightly. The desk is a wooden board angled at roughly 45 degrees, which is the correct angle for the hand and wrist when forming letters over an extended period, steep enough to keep the writing surface visible without bending the neck, shallow enough to prevent the ink from running before it dries. On the desk before you, a single sheet of prepared vellum, ruled with faint lines made by pressing a stylus against the surface, creating shallow grooves that guide the script without mocking it. A small knife for scraping errors. A pumice stone for smoothing the surface before you begin, and for abrading small mistakes before the knife is needed. A quill of a goose or swan feather, cut to a specific nib width and hardened by curing, replaced when it softens, which is regularly. And the ink is iron gall. It is made from oak galls, the small spherical growths that form on oak trees when a wasp lays eggs in the bark, ground and boiled with iron sulfate and a binding agent, usually gum arabic. The resulting liquid is not black when first applied. It is pale brown, almost tan, which is disorienting the first time you encounter it. It darkens as it oxidizes, turning to the deep brown, black of the manuscripts that survive. What you are writing in at this moment is a substance that is still in the process of becoming itself. The page you are filling will look different in an hour than it does now. There is one note in the margin of a manuscript, a psalter, produced in a German scriptorium in the 9th century, that scholars have been quoting for over 100 years. It is about the conditions in this room. It is not about God. We will come back to it. The man who wrote it has been dead for 12 centuries, and his complaint is still legible, and it still sounds like something written this morning. The work is copying, not composing, not interpreting, not adding, copying. The exemplar, the source manuscript, is positioned to your left on a reading stand, open to the page you are reproducing. You look left at the text, hold it in your memory in segments of 7 to 12 letters, more than that, and you introduce errors. Fewer and the pace becomes unsustainable. Turn to the desk. And reproduce what you held. Look left, hold right, look left, hold right for hours. The letters must be consistent. The spacing must be consistent. The margins must be maintained. The ruling lines are a guide, not a guarantee. The hand must learn to sit on the line, between the lines, with a precision that becomes automatic over years of practice and degrades the moment attention lapses. A letter that wanders below the baseline, a word that crowds into the margin, a line that curves upward toward the right. These are errors. The knife corrects them, scraping the surface of the vellum until the offending mark is gone, and the surface is smooth enough to receive a fresh letter. Scraped vellum accepts ink differently than unscraped vellum. The correction is visible to the trained eye forever. But that wasn't the strangest part. The vellum itself required weeks of preparation before it arrived at your desk. Vellum is animal skin, calf most commonly, or sheep or goat, prepared by soaking in a lime solution that loosens the hair, stretching the wet skin on a wooden frame and scraping it repeatedly with a curved blade called a lanellum while it dries under tension. The tension is essential. It is what produces the characteristic thinness and translucency of high-quality vellum, the surface tight and pale as old ivory. A skilled parchment maker could produce a sheet thin enough to be nearly transparent, thin enough, in some cases, that the ruling lines impressed on one side are visible through to the other. The quantity of animals required for a major manuscript was significant. Full Bible, the kind that a wealthy monastery might commission as a prestige object, to be placed on the altar or presented to a patron, required the skins of approximately 160 calves. This number was understood by the community that produced it. The manuscript was not just a text. It was also an accounting of resources, of labor, of animal lives, of years. A monk in a moderately productive scriptorium might copy 2 to 4 pages of finished text per day, depending on the script style. The compressed Caroline minuscule moved faster than the elaborate insular half-uncial, and the complexity of any decoration required. A full Bible at 4 pages per day represented years of a single monk's working life. Most manuscripts were produced by multiple hands, the work divided between copyists and the rubricators who added the red headings and initial letters, and the illuminators who produced decorated pages if the manuscript warranted them. The work was silent. The rule's silence extended into the scriptorium during working hours, with signing permitted for necessary communications. More ink, a different exemplar, the knife. A monk who needed to speak for a purpose the signs could not cover would approach the scriptorium master and communicate in a low voice, briefly, and return to his desk. The scriptorium master's primary role was quality control, reviewing completed pages, identifying errors, deciding whether a scrape and correct was sufficient or whether a page needed to be cut from the gathering and replaced, which was expensive and produced a particular quality of silence when it was announced. 3 things made the scriptorium function as a production system. First, the stability of the community, the same monks at the same desks, developing the same hand over years, producing consistent output. Second, the rule's prohibition on idleness, which meant that the hours not occupied by liturgy and prayer were available for work without negotiation or motivation beyond the structure of the day itself. Third, the complete absence of alternatives. There was nowhere else to be. The desk was the day. The day was the desk. The manuscript accumulated. It was production. It just looked like prayer, and here is the part most historians quietly skip. The monks complained, not in the sermons, not in the theological texts, not in the chronicles, but in the margins. The margins of manuscripts were the one place where the hand that had been forming careful, approved text for hours could briefly form something else, and the something else was frequently personal, frequently tired, and occasionally magnificent. The colophon was a formal convention, a note at the end of a manuscript recording when it was completed, by whom, and sometimes where. These were official. They were intended to survive. But the interlinear notes and margin glosses, the annotations added between lines of text, or in the white space at the page edges, were often more spontaneous, and the most spontaneous of them are the ones that have been quoted most frequently by every historian who has encountered them, because they sound exactly like something written today by a person doing a task they find difficult in conditions they find unpleasant. The note from the 9th century German Psalter reads in translation from its Latin something close to, "The parchment is hairy, the ink is thin, it is dark, and my arm hurts." The original Latin is brief, 6 words in some reconstructions, 8 in others, depending on how the abbreviations are resolved, and it sits in the lower margin of a page of psalm text, written in the same hand as the main text, which means the monk who wrote the psalm wrote the complaint, and the complaint is 1,200 years old, and it sounds like an email sent at 4 in the afternoon on a Thursday. Other surviving examples from various houses and centuries include a monk who noted that the previous scribe had made an error on the facing page, and he was now correcting it, with a tone suggesting he had done this before and expected to do it again. A monk who wrote, in Irish, that it was cold and his hand was cramping. A monk who copied a recipe for ink in the margin of a theological text immediately below a passage about the immortality of the soul, apparently because the margin was available and the recipe was useful and the juxtaposition did not trouble him. And a monk, this one at a scriptorium in what is now Austria, in the 12th century, who wrote, in a hand slightly less controlled than the surrounding text, that he wished he were somewhere else, and did not specify where, because anywhere was implied. A monk named, the manuscript identifies the house but not the individual, working at a scriptorium in the Loire Valley in the late 9th century, spent 8 hours on a Wednesday in November, producing 3.5 pages of a commentary on the Gospel of John. The light from the north window was adequate until the 9th hour, when the sun dropped below the angle that produced useful illumination, and the candles were brought in, and the candle light was warm, toned and slightly unsteady and harder on the eyes than the gray window light, and the 3rd page shows it. The letters of the final 3 lines are marginally less consistent than those above them, the spacing fractionally uneven, the descenders of the letters G and P reaching slightly further below the baseline than the scriptorium master would have preferred. He scraped 2 letters on the final line. The scrape marks are still visible. In the lower margin of that page, in the same hand, he wrote 4 words. The translation is approximate. It is almost vespers. He was correct. The vespers bell rang within the hour. He put down the quill, he went to church, he came back the next morning and finished the half page. Imagine explaining this to a modern person. You spent your life, you say, copying books by hand in cold rooms without complaining officially. Yes, but you complained unofficially in the margins, extensively, with specificity. Yes, and those complaints are now in museum archives and have been translated into 17 languages. That is what happened, and the books survived partly because of how carefully you copied them. Also, yes, the parchment was hairy, the ink was thin, it was dark, the arm hurt, and the page was finished anyway, because the rule said the page would be finished, and the rule was not interested in the arm. Work wasn't punishment. It was the structure inside which everything else became possible, and the structure had margins. And the margins, it turned out, were the most honest part of the document. The monk's complaint about his arm is understandable. The work was physical in the way that any sustained precision task becomes physical, in the neck, in the shoulder, in the particular fatigue of a hand that has formed the same sequence of letters several thousand times, but the body in the monastery was not left entirely to accumulate its injuries unaddressed. There was a room for that too. There was always a room. The rule had a room for everything. The punishment for getting the work wrong, however, came before the infirmary. It came in the morning, in a room off the cloister that was smaller than the refectory and considerably less comfortable, where the community gathered not to eat but to confess. To each other, in detail, on a schedule, the chapter of faults was already in session. Someone had already spoken, and the thing they had confessed was not, strictly speaking, the worst thing that had happened that week, because the worst thing was addressed elsewhere, in private, with the abbot, for reasons the rule explained carefully, and the monks understood completely. Welcome to the chapter house. It is a square room off the east walk of the cloister, stone, floored and stone-seated, a continuous bench running along 3 walls where the monks sit in the same order they observe everywhere. Senior to junior, the abbot's chair at the east end on a slight raise that is not quite a platform, but functions as one. The room is used for business, the reading of the martyrology, the announcement of the day's work assignments, the discussion of practical matters the rule permits to be discussed. And then, at a point in the morning that the community knows by habit rather than signal, the business portion ends. The abbot says the word, the chapter of faults begins. Every day, in a functioning Benedictine community, the monks gathered in the chapter house and accused themselves. Not privately, not in the confessional, that was a separate process, with a separate function, for a separate category of sin. This was public. This was the community assembled, and the monk standing in the center of the room, and the monk naming what he had done wrong since the last chapter, in front of everyone who had been there when he did it. The rule specified that monks should confess their faults voluntarily. It also specified that other monks could, if they had witnessed a fault, raise it publicly if the offending monk had not already done so. The combination produced a system in which the incentive to confess voluntarily was strong, because the alternative was being accused by someone else, which carried an additional weight of public correction that voluntary confession avoided. The chapter of faults was, among other things, a sophisticated social pressure mechanism that had been running continuously in various forms since the earliest desert communities of the 4th century. The faults themselves were categorized. The rule distinguished between light faults, minor infractions of the daily schedule, small failures of attention, the involuntary, and grave faults, which involved deliberate disobedience, persistent behavior, or conduct that damaged the community's functioning. Above grave faults were mortal faults, which involved the most serious violations and were addressed by the most serious penances, up to and including excommunication from the community, which in a total institution meant exclusion from the table, from prayer in common, from all interaction with the other monks until the abbot determined that sufficient penance had been performed. One fault could not be confessed in chapter. The rule was specific about this. We will come back to it. The reason is both practical and psychologically astute, and it reveals something about how the rule understood human nature that the rest of the document sometimes obscures. A monk who arrived late to the night office, who failed to reach the church before the Gloria of the first psalm, which was the rule's threshold for on-time arrival, confessed this. A monk who had smiled at an inappropriate moment during the liturgy confessed this. A monk who had broken something, spoken when silence was required, made an unnecessary noise with his bowl in the refectory, looked at another monk with an expression the rule classified as presumptuous. These were confessable faults, small infractions of the continuous code of behavior the rule maintained from waking to sleeping. The penance for a light fault was usually a prostration, lying face down on the floor of the chapter house until the abbot indicated the monk could rise, or a brief period of additional fasting, or an assignment of additional psalms to be recited privately. The prostration was the most common. It was physical, public, brief, and effective. The monk was on the floor, the community was watching, the point was made, the matter was closed. But that wasn't the strangest part. The grave fault carried heavier consequence. A monk found guilty of a grave fault by his own confession or by community accusation was excluded from the common table. He ate alone after the community had eaten from a reduced portion. He was excluded from the oratory during the common offices and prayed separately. No monk was permitted to speak with him, bless him, or acknowledge him except by the abbot's specific direction. He was, within the small world of the monastery, invisible, present but treated as absent, which in a community where human contact was already strictly rationed amounted to a form of solitary confinement without the cell. The duration of this exclusion was at the abbot's discretion. The rule gave the abbot broad authority here, and the Benedictine tradition recognized that discretion was not the same as arbitrariness. A good abbot calibrated the penance to the monk's character, his history, his apparent sincerity of contrition. A monk who had committed the same fault repeatedly required a longer exclusion than one who had committed it once. A monk who showed signs of genuine distress at the separation required different handling than one who appeared indifferent. The abbot was, among his other functions, a diagnostician of conscience, and the chapter of faults was his primary diagnostic instrument. 3 things had to be true for the chapter of faults to function as intended. The community had to be small enough that everyone's behavior was visible to everyone else, which in a Benedictine house of moderate size, 20 to 40 monks, was reliably the case. The abbot had to be trusted enough that his judgments were accepted without resentment, which was not always the case, and which the rule acknowledged by providing, in its later chapters, a process for monks to appeal to the bishop if the abbot became tyrannical. And the monks had to believe that the process served their spiritual development rather than simply functioning as social control, which was the harder condition to maintain over years, and the one that the best abbots worked hardest to preserve. Best case scenario: the monk confesses a small fault, performs the prostration, rises, returns to his seat, and the community registers the confession and moves on within 90 seconds. The matter is settled. There is no residue. The rule has processed the infraction and returned the monk to good standing without drama or extended consequence. Worst case scenario: a monk is accused by another monk of a fault the first monk denies, and the chapter house becomes the site of a dispute that the abbot must adjudicate in front of the community. Reading 2 accounts of the same event and determining which is more credible, with both monks watching him and the community watching both monks, and the whole thing playing out in a room where nobody is allowed to murmur or shift their weight in a way that constitutes taking sides. The rule did not say what to do in this exact situation. The abbot had to decide. He usually did, and here is the part most historians quietly skip. The chapter of faults produced records. Not transcripts. No one was writing down the individual confessions, but the patterns of what was confessed accumulated in the community's institutional memory, and the customaries that survive from major houses include sections on common faults, typical penances, and the specific circumstances that aggravated or mitigated a monk's culpability. These sections read like case law, which is what they are: accumulated precedent, organized by category, produced by centuries of abbots deciding the same questions. The most frequently confessed faults, across the surviving evidence, cluster predictably: lateness to the offices, failure of attention during prayer, violations of the silence rules, small thefts from the kitchen or the stores, failures of manual labor, arriving late to the work assignment, performing it inadequately, leaving before the bell. These are the infractions of the schedule, the frictions of communal living, the small abrasions that accumulate when the same people share the same space under the same rules for years. The fault that could not be confessed in chapter, the category the rule explicitly reserved for private address with the abbot alone, was any fault against chastity. Not because it was the most serious fault in the rule's hierarchy, though it occupied a significant position there, because public confession of a fault against chastity was, the rule understood, its own form of temptation. A monk confessing in detail, in public, the nature of his thoughts or actions regarding another person, possibly another monk in the same room, was producing information that the community then possessed. The information was not neutral. It could produce curiosity, comparison, the particular attention that scandal generates in an enclosed community where novelty is rare and the inner lives of the people around you are the primary entertainment available, the rule sent these confessions to the abbot's cell instead. The monk came privately. The abbot heard the fault privately. The penance was assigned privately. The community knew, in general, that the category existed. The rule had told them explicitly that it did, but the specifics remained between the monk, the abbot, and, in the rules, understanding God. A monk who had been in a community for 20 years understood this architecture completely. He knew what was confessable in chapter and what was not. He knew which of his faults fell into which category, and he knew which of those categories the abbot would receive with patience, and which with something less than patience. And he had adjusted his behavior over the years in response to this knowledge, not always successfully but consistently, the way any person adjusts behavior in response to a system that has been watching them long enough to know their patterns. He went to chapter. He confessed what was confessable. He performed the prostration when it was required. He rose. He returned to his seat. Imagine explaining this to a modern person. You had a daily meeting, you say, where everyone confessed their mistakes in public. Yes, and one category of mistake was too sensitive for the public meeting. Yes, and the solution was a private meeting with the manager. That is essentially correct. And this system ran continuously, without interruption, for centuries. In most major communities, yes, and honestly, as management systems go, it had advantages. The faults were small and addressed quickly. The exclusion ended when the abbot said it ended. Nothing accumulated into something larger, because nothing was left unaddressed long enough to accumulate. The chapter of faults was, in structural terms, a pressure relief valve that operated daily, which meant the pressure never had time to build to the levels that produce the larger failures. Sin wasn't private in the monastery. It was administered, and the administration had a chair at the east end of the room, and the chair had eyes, and the eyes had seen most of this before, and the abbot was usually not surprised. The monk's sins were managed. So was his body, and the monastery had a room for that too, which operated on its own schedule, its own economy, and its own very specific logic about what the body required in order to continue performing the work the rule demanded of it. The infirmarian was already awake. He was almost always already awake. The infirmary was on the south side of the precinct, which was the warmest side because warmth was, in the infirmary, considered relevant to recovery in a way it was not considered relevant anywhere else in the monastery, and 4 times a year, on a date announced in advance, almost the entire community was going to be weak, slightly dizzy, and excused from the night office. The date was approaching. The infirmarian had already sharpened what he needed. The calendar called it necessary. The rule called it maintenance. The monks called it the day, and they knew exactly which day it was, and they were not looking forward to it with uncomplicated feelings. That is a very Benedictine solution. Welcome to the South Range. It is warmer here than anywhere else in the precinct, which is the point. The infirmary occupies the building that catches the most sun south, facing, sheltered from the prevailing wind by the church on the west and the chapter house range on the north, and this positioning was not accidental. The rule specified that the sick were to be treated with particular care, as though they were Christ himself, which is the kind of instruction that sounds metaphorical until you realize it was intended operationally. The infirmary was the room where the rule relaxed. Meat was permitted here. A fire was permitted here. The silence was lighter. The schedule was adjusted. The sick monk ate when he could eat and slept when he needed to sleep, and the bell that governed everyone else's body did not govern his. The infirmarian is already here. He has been here since before Lauds. The monastic infirmary was, by any reasonable measure, the most medically sophisticated space in early medieval Europe. This is a statement that requires context, because the competition was not strong. Most medical care in the early medieval period was domestic, performed by family members, by local women with knowledge of herbs and preparation, by priests who combined spiritual and practical intervention in proportions that varied by practitioner. The monastery's infirmary had advantages that most of Europe lacked: a permanent dedicated space, a practitioner whose sole responsibility was the sick, a garden specifically cultivated for medicinal plants, access to a library that included at least some copies of late antique medical texts, and a community that was stable enough to observe what worked over time. The infirmarian was a senior monk appointed for aptitude and temperament, patience, specifically, and the ability to function without adequate sleep, which was a requirement rather than preference. He kept the infirmary stocked from the herbarium, the garden of medicinal plants maintained on the south side of the precinct, cultivated according to lists that traced back, in many houses, to the Capitulaire de Vigils of Charlemagne, a 9th century administrative document that specified which plants a well-ordered estate should grow. Feverfew for headache, Bitani for anxiety and digestive complaint, lungwort for respiratory illness, the name deriving from the plant's spotted leaves, which resembled diseased lung tissue, and which medical theory of the period took as a sign of the plant's appropriate use, valerian for sleep. There is one day in the monastic calendar on which almost the entire community was weak, slightly dizzy, and officially excused from the night office. It came 4 times a year. The infirmarian planned for it weeks in advance. The date was not a surprise. The condition it produced was not a surprise. The monks knew it was coming and arranged themselves accordingly, and the knowledge did not make it easier. We will come back to the day. The instruments were already prepared. The calendar had already been consulted. For now, the infirmary's ordinary work, which was substantial. The monastic diet, adequate in calories, low in variety, heavy in legumes and bread, light in protein beyond the feast days, produced predictable deficiencies over time. Night blindness in communities where the vitamin sources were limited, skin conditions, dental deterioration, which the surviving skeletal evidence from monastic burial grounds confirms at rates higher than contemporary secular populations, possibly because monastic bread was finer ground and more fermentable than peasant bread, and therefore more destructive to enamel. Repetitive strain in the scriptorium hands, the particular cramping of the fingers that copyists documented in their margins, the shoulder and neck pain of a life spent bent over a desk in insufficient light, the infirmarian treated these with what he had. The herbarium provided most of it. Trade and donation provided the rest. Imported spices with medicinal properties, pepper, ginger, cinnamon, which arrived in monastery stores as luxury goods and were deployed in the infirmary as medicine because the categories overlapped more than they diverged, and a warming spice administered to a monk with a failing appetite was both a treatment and a kindness, and the rule permitted kindness to the sick. But that wasn't the strangest part. The monastery also had books, not medical textbooks in the modern sense. The tradition available in most houses ran through Isidore of Seville's encyclopedic etymology, through fragments of Galen and Dioscorides in Latin translation, through practical herbals of varying reliability. These texts agreed on a great deal, and what they agreed on formed the theoretical foundation of monastic medicine. The body was governed by 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, and illness resulted from imbalance among them. The restoration of balance was the goal of treatment. The primary tool for restoring balance was removal, specifically bloodletting. The theory was coherent within its own terms. If a patient was feverish, the fever indicated excess heat, which was associated with blood, which meant the blood was in surplus and required reduction. If a patient was melancholic, depressed, slow, cold, the black bile was dominant and the blood insufficient, and the treatment was to encourage blood's production rather than its removal through diet and warming. The practice of removing blood directly by cutting a vein or applying leeches to draw blood to the surface was the most direct mechanical intervention available, and it was applied with a regularity that the modern reader finds startling, and that medieval practitioners found self-evidently correct. The monastery formalized bloodletting into a scheduled maintenance practice. The day the community had been anticipating, the day of the quarterly bloodletting, was called the minutio, and it came 4 times a year, timed to the changing seasons, because the humors were understood to shift with the seasons, and the body required adjustment at each transition. Every monk who was not already ill was bled. The infirmarian opened a vein, usually in the arm, the median cubital vein, the same one used for blood draws today, collected the blood in a bowl, assessed the quantity and quality, and bandaged the wound. 3 things happened immediately after. The monk was excused from the night office, matins and lauds, the prayers that required rising at 2 in the morning, for 2 or 3 days following the minutio. He was assigned to the misericord, the mercy room adjacent to the infirmary, where the dietary restrictions were suspended. Meat was served, eggs were served, the wine allowance was increased. He was permitted to sleep longer than the rule ordinarily allowed. The post-bleeding period was, in structural terms, the closest thing the monastic year offered to a holiday, and the records suggest the monks were aware of this and did not find the awareness spiritually troubling. Best-case scenario, the vein is located efficiently, the cut is clean, the quantity removed, typically 6 to 8 ounces, roughly a cup, is appropriate to the monk's size and constitution, and he is in the misericord within the hour, eating roasted chicken and sleeping without the bell. Worst-case scenario, the vein is difficult, the infirmarian makes a second attempt, the monk's blood pressure drops faster than expected, and he spends 2 days genuinely unwell in the infirmary, rather than pleasantly recuperating in the misericord. The records note that this happened. The records note it without particular alarm. The infirmarian kept a ledger. He recorded the date of each monk's bloodletting, the amount removed, his assessment of the blood's appearance, thin or thick, light or dark, which carried diagnostic meaning in humoral theory, and any notable reaction. These ledgers survive in several houses. They are, as documents go, extraordinarily detailed. A continuous record of a community's physical condition over years, in the infirmarian's careful hand, updated 4 times annually. A senior monk, a man perhaps 50 years old, who had been in the community since his oblation at age 7, had been bled 3 times by the time the record we are imagining reaches him. He knew the procedure precisely. He arrived at the infirmary at the appointed hour, sat in the appointed chair, extended his arm in the appointed way. The infirmarian, who had bled him for the past 15 years, knew which vein sat cleanest, what quantity produced the best result, how long the monk needed before he was steady enough to walk. Unassisted to the misericord, the monk spent 2 days in the misericord, eating meat and sleeping past prime. He did not complain about the bleeding. He did not, as far as the record suggests, enjoy it. He treated it with the same flat acceptance he brought to everything the rule required of his body. The cold floors, the interrupted sleep, the decades of legumes, because the rule's claim on his body had been total since he was 7 years old, and the body had eventually stopped having strong opinions about individual days. Imagine explaining this to a modern person. You scheduled a medical procedure, you say, 4 times a year, for the entire community as preventive maintenance. Yes, and the recovery period involved better food and more sleep than ordinary life. Also, yes, and you kept detailed records of everyone's blood. The infirmarian did, yes, and this was the best medical care available in the region. In most cases, it was the only medical care available in the region. It was health care. It was also the schedule, and the schedule had been running uninterrupted since before anyone in the building could remember when it started. The body wasn't personal in the monastery. It was communal property, maintained on a communal timetable, for the purpose of keeping it functional enough to perform the work the rule required. The infirmarian was the maintenance engineer. The minutio was the quarterly service. The ledger was the log. And honestly, given the alternatives available in the 9th century, a monastery with a herbarium and a ledger and an infirmarian who knew which vein sat cleanest was not the worst place to be sick. It was not a good place to be sick, but it was not the worst. By now you have seen the monk eat, copy, confess, and bleed. What you have not seen is what he did at 2 a.m, in the dark, in the cold church, with the bell still ringing in the dormitory and the candle in his hand, and 40 minutes of prayer ahead of him before he was permitted to return to bed. The circator was already moving through the dormitory. His lamp was already lit. He had already passed 3 cells, and in the 3rd cell, the breathing was not the breathing of a man who was waking up. We will come to the lamp. We will come to what he did with it. The rule was specific, and the rule in this one instruction is almost kind. Welcome to the darkest hour. It is somewhere between 2 and 3 in the morning. The monastery is not silent. It is never fully silent because the building breathes, the wind moves through the gaps in the stone, the trees in the garden shift and settle. But it is as quiet as it gets, which is very quiet, and the quiet has a quality that daytime quiet does not have. It is thicker. It presses slightly. You have woken into it many times, and you have never entirely made peace with it. And the rule does not ask you to make peace with it. The rule asks only that you get up. The bell is ringing. The night office, called vigils or matins, or the nocturnes, depending on the tradition and the century, was the liturgical anchor of the Benedictine day, which is a misleading phrase because the Benedictine day does not begin at dawn. It begins here in the dark, at an hour that most of the sleeping world will not see. Benedict was specific about the timing. In winter, the monks rose well before dawn, around 2 a.m. by modern reckoning, to allow time for the office and then a period of reading before lauds, which was sung at first light. In summer, when the nights were short and dawn came early, the timing compressed, but the office remained. There was no night in the Benedictine year on which vigils was cancelled. There was no weather, no illness of the community collectively, no circumstance the rule anticipated that suspended it. The bell rang, you got up. The dormitory was a long room on the upper floor of the East Range, one large shared space in the early tradition, rather than individual cells, because individual cells created privacy, and privacy created the conditions for things the rule preferred to make difficult. Each monk slept in his habit, which was not a hygiene choice but a practical one. You were already dressed when the bell rang, which reduced the time between the bell and your arrival in the church to the minimum the human body required to move from horizontal to upright and down a flight of stairs. There is one monk whose entire job, every night of the monastic year, was to walk through the dormitory during vigils and watch for the ones who were sleeping. He had a specific tool for waking them. We will come to the tool. It is not what you expect, and it is in the rule, and the rule's choice of this particular tool over the obvious alternatives says something about the document's author that the rest of the chapters only imply. The procession from the dormitory to the church was conducted in order and in silence, each monk carrying a candle, the only light source available, walking in the dark through the covered walkway of the cloister, entering the church from the south door, moving to his place in the choir. Choir was the arrangement of stalls, wooden seats with hinged misericords, small ledges on the underside of the seat that folded down to provide a perch for a monk who needed to rest his weight during the long-standing passages of the office without technically sitting, which was a distinction the rule found meaningful and the monks found useful. The stalls faced each other across the central aisle of the choir, senior monks on one side, junior on the other, candles placed in their holders, breath fogging in the cold air. The cantor began. But that wasn't the strangest part. The night office was the longest of the 8 daily offices, longer than lauds, longer than vespers, longer than compline, which closed the day and was brief and gentle, and followed immediately by the grand silence that lasted until after lauds the next morning. Vigils was not gentle, it was extensive. The rule specified 12 psalms for the winter night office on ordinary days, plus readings from Scripture and from the fathers of the church, plus responses sung between the readings. On Sundays, the structure expanded further, 3 nocturnes rather than 1, each with its own set of psalms and readings, the whole office running to something close to 2 hours in duration. 2 hours of liturgy in the middle of the night, standing mostly, in an unheated stone church, in the dark, except for the candles, which provided enough light to read the text, and not enough warmth to matter. The monks had been doing this every night for years. Most of them had been doing it since childhood. The oblates, the boys offered to the monastery before they could choose, had grown up with the night bell, and their bodies had adjusted to it the way bodies adjust to any recurring disruption. Not by finding it pleasant, but by finding it inevitable, which is the body's form of acceptance. They woke before the bell sometimes. The bell rang anyway. 3 things made vigils survivable in the long term. The first was the structure of the office itself. The psalms were known, the responses were known, the movements were known, and the familiarity of the liturgy meant that the mind did not need to be fully present to participate. The body could sing the psalm while the mind was somewhere quieter. This was not considered ideal. It was considered human. The second was the community. You were not alone in the dark. You were surrounded by the same people who had been here last night and would be here tomorrow night, and the collective sound of chanting created a warmth that the stone could not exactly absorb entirely. The third was the understanding, which the Benedictine tradition built carefully into its theological framing, that this was the purpose of the monastery, not the manuscripts, not the agriculture, not the hospitality. Those were the outputs. This was the purpose: prayer in the dark, prayer when prayer was hardest. Prayer precisely because it was 2 in the morning, and the body wanted nothing except to be horizontal. Best case scenario, you wake before the bell, you are in your stall before the cantor begins. The psalm you know best is the first psalm of the first nocturne, and the chanting settles into its rhythm within the first minute and carries you through the next 2 hours in something that is not quite wakefulness and not quite sleep, but is its own state, which the monastic tradition had a word for and which felt, on the good nights, almost like the thing the rule promised it was. Worst case scenario, you did not sleep well after compline. The cold reached your stall before you did. The reading chosen for tonight is one you find difficult, and somewhere in the second nocturne, your chin touches your chest, and you are briefly, unmistakably, asleep in the choir during the night office, which is a fault, which you will confess in chapter in the morning, which means one more prostration on the stone floor which your knees have opinions about. This happened. It happened to everyone eventually. The records confirm it. The chapter of false records confirm it. The monks who wrote about their own lives confirm it. Falling asleep during vigils was the most common single infraction in the Benedictine chapter of faults, because it was the infraction most directly produced by the rule itself. The rule required the sleep deprivation that caused the falling asleep, that required the confession of the falling asleep, that required the penance that the rule also specified. The rule understood this, which is why there was the circator. And here is the part most historians quietly skip. The circator was not a punisher. He was not a disciplinarian in the sense that the word implies threat. He was a specific office, a monk assigned on a rotating basis to walk the dormitory and the choir during vigils, and identify those who had fallen asleep. And the rule, in specifying what he should do when he found a sleeping monk, made a choice that every other ancient rule of religious life either did not make or made differently. The tool was a candle. The circator carried a lamp. He was required to carry it, because the dormitory was dark, and the cloister was dark, and the church was lit only by the choir candles, and he needed to see. When he found a monk asleep in his stall, he did not shake him. He did not speak. Speaking during the office was itself a fault, and the circator was not exempt from the rule simply because he was enforcing it. He did not strike the stall or make noise. He held the candle close to the sleeping monk's face, not close enough to burn, close enough that the warmth reached the skin, close enough that the light, even through closed eyelids, registered as light. He held it there, in silence, until the eye opened. That was the method. Warmth and light, applied without contact, without sound, without violence or humiliation. The monk woke, saw the lamp, understood, straightened in his stall, and the circator moved on. The office continued. Nothing was interrupted. The fault would be addressed in chapter in the morning, in the ordinary way, and the monk would confess it and perform the prostration and return to his seat. And tomorrow night the bell would ring again, and he would get up again and walk to the church again. Benedict had specified the candle in a document that also specified how to discipline a monk who repeatedly refused correction, which involved corporal punishment as a last resort, in terms that are plain and unambiguous. He understood coercion. He had written coercion into the rule when he thought coercion was necessary. For the sleeping monk in the choir, he chose the candle, the warmth before the words, the light before the judgment. A monk who had been in the community for 30 years had been woken by the circator's lamp perhaps a dozen times. He knew the sensation, the warmth arriving before the consciousness, the light filtering through the eyelid, the particular quality of waking that is different from the bell because there is no sound, only the warmth, and then the lamp, and then the circator's face looking at him with nothing in it except the instruction to continue. He straightened. He found the psalm. The chanting continued around him, the same voices, the same words, the same dark church. Outside, the sky was still completely black. Dawn was 2 hours away. The office would run until lauds, and lauds would run until the sky was light, and then prime, and then the work of the day, and then terce, and sext, and none, and vespers, and compline, and the grand silence and the bell. Imagine explaining this to a modern person. You woke someone up, you say, by holding a candle near their face. In silence, because the rules said no noise. Yes, and the warm light was the signal. Also yes, and they woke up and just continued without complaint, without acknowledgement. They continued, and this was considered a complete and sufficient interaction. It was, and then it happened again, eventually. It always did. And the candle came again. Yes, the circator moved through the dark. The lamp passed. The eye opened. The psalm continued. This was the night. It was always the night. It was 2 a.m. on an ordinary Wednesday in an ordinary year in a monastery on a hill, and 40 men were standing in the dark singing the same words they had sung the night before, and the night before that, and the night before that, in a chain that ran back through their predecessors in this building, and through their predecessors in other buildings, back through centuries to the desert fathers who had first decided that the dark hours required occupation, and the occupation required voices, and the voices required a community, and the community required a rule. The circator moved through the dark without a word. The candle passed, the eye opened, and then it was quiet again. It was 2 a.m. It was Tuesday. It always was. If you're still watching, that means you made it all the way through the streets of ancient Rome with me. So, thank you for staying. And if you didn't, that's kind of perfect. Because these stories were never meant to be rushed. They are meant to linger slowly in the background until your mind lets go. So whether you're still here or already asleep, I'll see you in the next one.